It's so obvious, they can't help but overlook it. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I want to talk to you about a serious issue and how the Army overlooks the obvious. Now, frankly, I think that suicide has been a companion of the military for millennia, and that our growing awareness of the connection between military service and suicide rates is just a reflection of the increasing professionalism that you see in the profession of arms. Plus, I think that if you looked at the actions of military leaders at all levels, you would see a genuine desire to do something to address an issue that they know is there, but they don't fully understand. Today, we're talking about suicide prevention policy and suicide risk factors. Now, if you go to DAPAM 600-24, you're going to see that there's a list of 18 risk factors that the Army associates with suicide. But I want to start someplace else and then come back to this policy. Instead, I want to start with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Suicide Prevention Program. The CDC has a suicide risk model that groups risk factors into 4 categories: individual, relationship, community, and societal. And for each category, they group risk factors. Familiar examples would be financial difficulties are included under individual, or loss of relationships is under relationships. Now, this CDC model happens to be the basis of the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. And now, I'm not going to beleaguer you with all the details of the national strategy because I want to get to this point about what the Army overlooks. But there's 2 things I want to point out about the national strategy. First, the strategy was updated in 2012. And second, the Secretary of the Army was the public sector co-chair who signed off on this national strategy for suicide prevention. So let's get back to the Army's policy on risk factors that you see in the DAPAM. This document became effective in 2015, and just to save you the time of looking it up, it was signed by the same Secretary of the Army who signed the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. So you would think that these 18 risk factors that the Army is tracking would kind of line up with the CDC's risk model, right? Well, not exactly. I mean, when it comes to the CDC's individual risk factors, the Army gets almost every single one of them. In fact, I think that the Army is a little more specific than the CDC is about individual factors. Where the Army starts to skip some risk factors are in the other CDC categories. The first gap that I notice is in the relationships category, where the CDC notes loss of relationship and social isolation. The Army picks up on the loss of intimate relationships or the significant loss like the death of a loved one. But what the Army totally misses is that shipping off to basic or going on a deployment, that can be its own form of loss of relationships or social isolation. Now, the eagle-eyed among you are going to look at number 6 in the DAPAM, and you're going to notice that in parentheses, they do say social isolation. But look at how the Army words this part. Poor social skills to include difficulty interacting with others. They view social isolation as a problem caused by the soldier that has absolutely nothing to do with sticking 16 people on an observation post for weeks on end. But the mismatch between the CDC's understanding of risk factors and the Army's gets really telling as we move into the community category. Stress of acculturation? I mean, that starts the very first day you join the military, and it doesn't end as you move from place to place. And then there's community violence. To me, this is the big one. The Army's mission is to close with and destroy the enemy in the unrelenting crucible of ground combat, and everything we do prepares soldiers to be ready when that time comes. Our community is a community of violence. But in the DAPAM, the Army frets over violence in the home or in the social environment, completely ignoring violence in the community that they create. I'm not even going to waste time on the lack of health care, but you know. So here is what the Army gets wrong about suicide. they completely overlook their own role in causing it. Disrupting relationships, isolating people, exposing people to interpersonal violence. Now, you might be thinking, Chuck, it is pretty unprofessional of you to be airing this out when clearly you didn't do anything to address this when you were in uniform. Incorrect. I have been on this particular soapbox since 2010 when I was a young ORSA asked to look at some suicide data. I have shared this with everybody who showed the slightest interest in doing something about suicide, to include some teams led by 3 stars. Here's what I'd say. Think about what we do to a young recruit in their first year in the Army. The very first thing we do is we separate them from everybody they have known for their entire life. And then what we do is we take away their cell phones so they're good and isolated. And then we teach them to shoot, do hand-to-hand combatives, throw hand grenades, and place the mission before their personal needs. And then, just when they start to get their feet on the ground, we break them up and we send them off to advanced individual training. Lots of those relationships that they built in basic training, they're gone and they are never coming back. And what are they learning while they're in AIT? In general, more specific ways to kill human beings. So great, AIT, best friends forever, right? Wrong. We're going to chop those guys up into little groups and distribute them to installations all around the world. And guess what? When they get to that new assignment, they're the new guy trying to fit into an existing unit that is functioning as a team to be more effective in combat. Now, usually when I point out that progression, people start politely ignoring me and getting back to the task of exactly how do you predict the individual soldiers who are going to commit suicide. And see, I think this response explains why the Army overlooks these factors. It's not that our leaders don't know that this is an issue. It's that they don't know how to resolve it. I mean, all the separation and isolation and violence that you put people through, it's necessary if you want to build a ready army. You couldn't eliminate these aspects from the experience even if you wanted to. But that is what the Army really gets wrong about these stressors. They pretend that there's some mysterious force that requires a suicide prevention strategy. They hint very strongly that suicide prevention is only necessary because of the failings of some individuals. And all the while, they push the very stressors that tip an otherwise healthy person towards suicide. So here's how you address that without hamstringing your training program. You acknowledge that your training program itself is part of your suicide prevention strategy. You explain to young soldiers that wars are lost when soldiers lose morale, because it's not enough to be able to fight tonight. You have to be able to fight on in the face of separation, isolation, and unrelenting violence. To never quit and to never accept defeat, you have to face feelings of hopelessness and failure, and you have to overcome them. So while we teach you to be ready now, we are also teaching you to be resilient. We expose you to small tastes of these stressors when you go to basic and AIT in your first unit, so that you're ready when you have to face the real stressors. We do it in a controlled environment under the supervision of trained professionals who have experienced it themselves, so that you can be ready when the world throws everything at you. I know in my heart of hearts that military leaders want to prevent suicide. And the way to do that is by being open, honest, and clear about what really causes suicide and how integral those factors are to military service. Understanding what is really going on in the military is the first step to being truly successful as the greatest military in the world. Now, if you want to see another example of that, watch this video.